Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 9th of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me via video link is David Scott and Brian Gerrish. Welcome to the programme, gents.
Good to be here. Yeah, hello. It's very nice to be here.
Okay, well, we're going to get straight on with this. This is the Mirror. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un historic meeting could push world to brink of new war. This is fantastic. It is an historic meeting. There's no question about that. Donald Trump has accepted an invitation from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The meeting is planned to be in May, and this follows a full day of meetings yesterday in the White House between South Korea's National Security Chief Chung and their National Intelligence Service Director Soo, with President Trump and also McMaster and some others. And following that meeting, Chung said that the breakthroughs which had been achieved last week in the meetings in Pyongyang between himself and Kim Jong-un and other North Korean leaders had led to this. He said that Trump's leadership through his maximum pressure policy, together with international cooperation, had led to the decision by Kim Jong-un to agree to the denuclearization process, that was based on assurances for North Korean security, and that Kim had agreed to suspend testing of weapons and so on. Well, we reported that a couple of days ago. But just before we come onto this maximum pressure policy in a slightly different area, I just wanted to get your thoughts on this fantastic headline from the Mirror, because instead of taking a positive look at this, they have to ramp up the fear. We're on the brink of a new war.
Well, I think this is the aim: is ramping up the fear is a key part of the propaganda at the moment. Mike, we see it in virtually everything that's being talked about. And later in the news, we've got a picture of an anti-terrorism poster at Bristol Airport, which I encountered yesterday. It's just everywhere you look, we are to believe we're at the risk of terrorists, we're at the risk of a third world war. And all of this is being ramped up by the so-called mainstream media, the international mainstream media. When we look at what is really going on behind the scenes, we see that, as you've already said, this is not quite the case. So I think in this one that Trump, in his very black and white, some would say quite aggressive style, is trying to do the right thing. But it's clear that the international media are not going to work to try and help. They're going to be inflammatory. They're going to try and get people fearful as to what's taking place, instead of using it as progress in a positive direction.
Yes, and also insulting the intelligence of the readers. I mean, they're assuming that people will follow through with this fake news line that peace conferences mean that we're on the brink of war, when it's obviously the reverse is the case. And there's not going to be immediately having munitions flying across the border. So a positive story spun in a very strange way to heighten fear and alarm throughout the country.
Well, okay. Well, let's look at this maximum pressure policy, and I'm suggesting that that's what this is about as well. So the Independent here saying Liam Fox brands Trump's steel tariffs plan as absurd amid fears of global trade war, and the German press echoing that, really with similar language between the British politicians and the German politicians. So this is the local.de. Germany blasts Trump steel tariffs, vows cool and clear response. Now, it occurred to me, I'm reading this in this way, because if we go back to May last year, Donald Trump was at the inauguration of the new NATO headquarters in Brussels. And he had this to say to the gathered politicians from Europe.
I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves.
So that's what Trump said in May last year to the sniggers of the European leaders that were there. But yesterday he was holding a cabinet meeting in Washington where he again specifically mentioned Germany and others. And he said that, you know, they had to bring up their defense spending to 2% of GDP. He said, if you look at NATO, where Germany pays 1%, and we're paying 4.2% of a much bigger GDP, that's not fair. He said that some friends and enemies had taken advantage of the United States on trade and on military. And he said that, you know, because Germany is only spending 1.13% of GDP, they need to step up to the plate and stump up the money. Germany, of course, denying that they owe anything. So to me, it seems, David, maybe you can comment on this first, but to me, this seems like Trump doing exactly what he's done with North Korea. He is pushing forward with the heavy-handed black and white tactics in an effort to get, you know, he's using steel as the bargaining chip in an effort to get the Europeans to do what he's been demanding for over a year now.
Yes, this seems to be his style. The means of negotiating here, which I've no doubt he's brought from his business life, is to appear tough and then trying to reach an agreement after some chest thumping and setting the agenda. It's interesting to note that just a couple of days ago, Zero Hedge reported that the EU had renewed its steel tariffs on cheap Chinese steel, and they're as high as 72%. So all of this criticism from the EU of the Trump approach is somewhat hypocritical.
Well, indeed, that's kind of what made me draw the conclusions that I've drawn, because if it had just been Trump applying tariffs to China and Russia, then perhaps that might have been understandable in the current sort of geopolitical context. But the fact that he's applying this to Europe, including Britain, there has to be some other reason for it.
There has, and you're quite right to identify the NATO and the increasing difficulty America is having meeting its international responsibilities. They are overstretched in the extreme, and they are losing power, and they can no longer afford the empire they have. And this is a means of trying to put a sticking plaster over that for some time, and I don't think it will work.
Yes. Now, David, stick with international affairs and we'll head over to Poland, because over the last few weeks there's been a bit of furore building over a new law that the Polish have instigated over the Holocaust, and whether the Polish can be legally accused of being involved in it or not. Gilad Atzmon has had something to say on this.
Yes, this is an important article where Gilad highlights the mindset that underpins a campaign that's been running in America. This is the Ruderman Family Foundation, a prominent Jewish American foundation, and it launched a campaign calling for the United States to sever all political ties with Poland over the introduction of the restrictive law in Poland on what can be said about the Holocaust. And they generated an extremely belligerent video, which I encourage people to go to Gilad Atzmon's site and view to support the campaign. This went viral throughout the Jewish world and then more broadly, and it repeats Polish Holocaust over and over again. and as people pledge to go to jail to maintain their freedom of speech. It's extremely aggressive, as Gilad Atzmon pointed out, and the response to call for complete severance of all political ties with Poland is extremely over the top. Gilad's point is that this is most unwise of the American Jewish community to try and manipulate American foreign policy in this way. And even the Poles who oppose this law, as I certainly do, anything that restricts free speech and examination of historical facts is something that shouldn't be put into law. But the Poles who oppose this law are also saying that the response from the American Jewish community is very unhelpful. And in fact, a Jewish scholar in Poland who pointed out how inaccurate this was and basically asked the Ruderman Foundation to desist from their campaign.
Well, we've got a couple of other headlines here from Politico. Poland's leaders barred from White House meetings over Holocaust law, and the Washington Post saying tensions rise between US and Poland over Holocaust law. How has the mainstream coverage of this been?
The mainstream coverage has failed to really grasp any of the subtleties or complexities of it, but they have reported on some reaction. Now, although this campaign in America seems to have backfired to some extent it's been successful, and there has been a political move. Now, it's not complete severance of all political ties, but it's fairly heavy hitting. There seems to have been a 3-point ultimatum issued by the Americans to the Polish government. There'll be no high-level bilateral contacts between the countries until the law is situation solved, and there will be no financing of military from Poland, and if anyone who carries an American passport is arrested under this law, the Poles have been told the results will be dramatic.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, let's come back to the UK. And last night, the Telegraph held their 1 year to Brexit event, and Boris Johnson was speaking at it. And here's what he had to say. He said, this is a paraphrase of it, he said that £350 million a week to the EU, no. We need to give them as much as possible, so we'll soon be giving them £438 million every week until we leave, in inverted commas. And he said that he's been running around with this big red bus that says £350 million on the side. He says they need a bigger bus. Brian, to me, this just seemed like, because of course we're looking at Brexit without the exit. One of the things that the EU is particularly concerned about is the loss of British contribution to the budget. But it seems that all of a sudden, for the next year or so, we're going to be paying the guts of an extra £100 million a month in the run-up to the date that we supposedly leave. And then, of course, during the transition period, probably everything's going to stay status quo for a further 2 years after that. So actually, by the end of the 3-year period, if we get to the other end of the transition period, it's a big if, that's quite a lot of money, extra money that we're going to be paying into the EU budget.
Well, it is, Mike. And what is going on here? Well, the key bit is we've been told we're having Brexit, but it's clear if you look at the policies, if you look at the speed at which the talks are advancing, there is no Brexit. This was always the plan. And I think the biggest thing we're seeing out of this now is every time the European Union says jump, we jump, whether it's to do with the laws, we have to stay adhering to the European Union laws. They say that we're going to have to pay more money into the pot. The UK jumps, we're going to pay more money into the pot. The UK has to carry on with the plan for EU military unification, and we're carrying on with that plan. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is breakdown in the Conservative Party, because I think it's true to say that most Conservative MPs have no idea what the real agenda of their party is. That real agenda, which is that we are not actually going to leave the European Union and never were. That policy is carried out at Cabinet Office. If you're a backbencher, you're just not aware of it. but it's quite clear that the EU is dictating the terms the whole way through. And we according to these events, we can see that effectively we're no longer a nation state. We can only function when the EU gives us permission to do so. And as this is happening, I don't think it's any coincidence that we're now getting these major reports that UKIP is going to collapse. The party is bankrupt. I think they've got to find £100,000 in a week, or a figure around about that sum. So the party that helped to drive that massive 17 million vote to take us out of Europe, that party's now in tatters at the exact point that we can see there is no movement to take us out of Europe, because the European Union seems to be in control. It's treason, Mike, and the more Theresa May says, the more I can point a finger at this government and say what you're doing is treason upon the nation.
Well, one of the things that we've been saying for quite some time is that there's all kinds of stuff being pushed through under the radar, and EU military unification is one of those, under the radar of Brexit, or under the cover of the noise generated by Brexit. One of the other policies that's clearly being driven forward here is regionalisation, and this is a European Union policy. So we have a new report here out from a think tank called the UK in a Changing Europe, Brexit, Local and Devolved Government. And they're basically talking about exactly that, the breakup of the UK as a result of Brexit. The report describes the UK as this unitary state with some devolved parts. They say that discussions over the future relationship of Northern Ireland, both with the Republic of Ireland and with the rest of the UK, have of course featured prominently in press coverage. But in the background, actually this is me saying this bit, but in the background, David Lidington has been holding meetings with devolved assemblies with almost no coverage in the press. And there was another such meeting yesterday, in fact, and as a result, a decision has been made to proceed with amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. The proposed amendment will mean that all EU powers will intersect with devolved competencies. That intersect with devolved competencies will go directly to the devolved parliaments and assemblies at the time of Brexit. In addition, there would be a provision for the UK government to maintain a temporary status quo arrangement over a small number of returning policy areas where an agreement for a UK framework had not been reached in time for EU exit. This is to protect the UK common market and ensure that no barriers are created for consumers and businesses. So David Lidington said the UK government has put forward a significant proposal to Clause 11 of the EU withdrawal bill, and it's now imperative that Parliament is given a chance to have a proper, open and informed discussion on it. While I remain hopeful that a deal can be done, we have a long-standing commitment to Parliament to bring forward an amendment that will and will now table it as discussed with the devolved administrations. I strongly believe our proposal would respect and strengthen the devolution settlements across the UK and do so in a way that still allows the UK government to protect the vitally important UK common market, providing such much needed certainty and no new barriers for families and businesses. The UK government has a proven track record on devolution. Our amendment is reasonable and we've moved a considerable way on it. We will continue to have close and regular discussions with the devolved administrations in the hope of reaching agreement around how a relatively small number of EU powers are managed in the early days of Brexit. And the report itself then finishes off by saying sovereignty lies at the heart of the debate over Britain's membership of the European Union. According to Lord Ashcroft's referendum day poll, the most commonly cited reason for voting leave was, quotes, the principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. Likewise, when the British Election Study Internet panel asked what matters most to you in deciding how to vote in the EU referendum, the modal response amongst Leave voters was sovereignty or one of its various synonyms. In fact, the whole EU debate arguably comes down to whether Britain should continue pooling its sovereignty with 27 other member states or whether it should reaffirm its national sovereignty by leaving. However, sovereignty is not simply a question of whether decisions should be made by the EU or UK. There are at least two other levels of decision making which powers should be repatriated after Brexit, the devolved administrations and cities and regions. So, David, this is quite an interesting report, and I do recommend people read it. But really what we're looking at here, to my mind, is the breakup of the Union in a regionalisation process, which is something that is at the heart of the European Union.
Indeed, and obviously Scotland is the cutting edge of that, and we'll talk more about that shortly. But yes, the introduction of city-states, the introduction of a form of government where the cry is devolution, but what it means in practice is increasingly obscure. Various decisions are made by various bodies and no one really knows why, and the ordinary person, the ordinary man and woman in the street, has things done to them and cannot really see a direct way of actually identifying where this is coming from, so that they can argue against it.
If I can just add a bit to that, Mike, I think this is exactly what I started to talk about, the policy that Mr. Lidington, if I've got his name right, this is coming out of the Cabinet Office. We've got this body that's now talking about regionalisation. Where did that body come from? Where does the money come from? Who are the people and what are their political allegiances? Those are questions which I'd like to know the answers to. But what is being done is the country is being divided against itself. We're told that devolution is to help people at lower community levels. But if you follow the policy through, what it means is that the national system of government is being broken up. We're giving rise to the city-states. We increasingly see the power of local mayors, for example, in the case in Cleveland, when we were talking about Mike Veal, the local mayor intervened to suggest that Mike Veal shouldn't have the post of chief constable. So we're now building these fiefdoms, and as you say, this was original European policy that nation states should be broken up into cantons, regions, and within those regions, the city-state should be given immense powers so that they are able to make a very significant political and local decisions behind closed doors with just a few people. This is very, very dangerous stuff.
Well, it is because, Brian, the danger is that you throw a dog a bone and it just wants a bigger bone.
Of course, and if we go back to the early days when people were starting to really understand that the European Union and its policies was a malevolent system, European money, the grant funding, was used to buy people. So you saw money flooding in for so-called regeneration projects, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development money coming in, New Deal money coming in. And what you saw happen was the local authorities switched their attention from national government, which had traditionally put in the bulk of the funding and then council tax topping that up. They started to turn their attention to the European Union funding pot. And this was the way in which local councils were bought by the European Union.
So, David, how is Brexit being used to drive the next referendum on independence for Scotland then?
Yes, this is an interesting story. Just before we get to that, it is relevant as well. This is a story here on the shortbread wars that are currently raging across Scotland. What you see here is a tin of extremely excellent shortbread. I recommend it, but you'll notice the Union flag on the tin. This has triggered enormous outrage amongst some of our Scottish National Party supporting comrades up here, and there has been an attack on the manufacturer responsible. A long-established Scottish company, and like many long-established Scottish companies, they're coming in for huge amounts of criticism from the nationalists whenever they do anything that recognises our place in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The attempt here, what's really playing out here, is an attempt to to make the concept of Britishness, the concept of the nation, the concept of United Kingdom completely unsayable. They're trying to make the brand toxic. They're trying to make it something that is a shameful thing, and they're trying to intimidate any organisation or any individual who maintains pride in their nation into silence. That's the war that's going on. The fact that this is a Scottish company, the fact that it employs 1,700 Scots, the fact that it exports all around the world is of no interest to the fake nationalists, because what they're seeking is control over how people think.
So here is the Scotsman then. The headline is SNP using Brexit showdown with Holyrood as dry run for IndyRef 2.
Yes, now the trick here is that there's an emergency legislation being put through Holyrood. Now, the definition of emergency legislation, you might be interested to find out, is it's an emergency if a Scottish Government minister says it's an emergency. That's the only definition there is. So all you need is a bare majority in the Scottish Parliament, and you can put anything through the Scottish Parliament in a day. Now they're taking 3 months, but that's still quite a rush rather than the usual 9 to put this through, and it's a continuity bill to do with the EU. Now the interesting thing about that is it is of course beyond the competence of the Scottish Parliament to legislate on constitutional matters. That is devolved to Westminster. So they're running through a piece of legislation which is beyond the competence of Parliament. It's illegal. And the interesting thing is, how far will they get? This has been viewed as a dry run for a second independence referendum, because it's very likely that, as there's no demand in Scotland for such a referendum, that Westminster would not entertain it. But the ideologues in Holyrood want to force it on the nation in any event. This second article here is a blog by a Scottish lawyer, and it explores this issue in greater depth, and it points out that there was a bill, the Please Don't Go to Sleep, the Footway Parking and Double Parking Scotland Bill 2015. Right, now the interesting thing about this was in 2015 this bill legislated or sought to legislate for a matter which was still reserved to Westminster and was entirely out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament. But nonetheless, it went almost all the way through, right through to committee stage, and it was only an election that headed it off at the pass. Now, the suggestion here is, well, look, how far can you actually go? Can you actually pass things through the Scottish Parliament, and then it's a case of taking a chance with the UK Supreme Court to see if they'll throw it out or not? Is that what the SNP have in mind? There's a lot of people who think that's exactly what's being planned.
Okay, and I'm kind of dropping this one on your head because you may not have seen it, but this is the Telegraph saying Jeremy Corbyn, Labour on the cusp of winning 20 more seats in Scotland at the next election and the next election. Sorry, and I just wanted to get a feeling from you about what the mood of the country is, because Labour, of course, at the last couple of elections has been pretty much decimated. Is the tide moving back in Labour's direction in Scotland?
Difficult to tell with the Scottish political scene being so divided between the nationalists and the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and with the first past the post system being in operation, small swings in supports, as you saw a couple of elections ago when the SNP almost swept the board. Small swings in support can harvest huge numbers of seats. Now, the Labour Party under Corbyn and the SNP under Sturgeon are very similar. They're both left-wing authoritarian parties. They are both essentially introducing a form of fascism, of huge state control, although a degree of public ownership is still allowed, but it's only nominal. Everything is dictated by the state. And there is very little to choose between them. It's a branding exercise. It's whether you wrap yourself in a Pantone 300 saltire, or if you wrap yourself in the red flag of communism. So it's a branding exercise. Which brand is going to be strongest in the next election? I'm not sure, but I think it's difficult for Labour to make huge inroads because they are essentially selling the same product, but they lack the saltire branding, which seems to be still somewhat in the ascendant.
Okay, thanks, David. Now, another day and another report on Britain's charities, and this is the Gatestone Institute, and they're calling this Britain's massive charity scam. They say the exploitation, they're talking about sexual exploitation, the exploitation is so wide that some Syrian women, they say, are refusing to go to distribution centres because people would assume they had offered their bodies for the aid they brought home. According to the BBC, this is a quote from the BBC that they've put in their report. The report says that more than half the humanitarian donations from the United Kingdom to Syria through small NGOs have ended up in the hands of ISIS and other jihadist groups, according to think tank Quilliam Foundation. In this way, millions of pounds, thanks to the generosity of British taxpayers, have fallen in the hands of terror groups. And they say Fatah Global, which should have brought help to Syrian refugees fleeing the war, instead diverted the funds to the Islamic State, the very terror group that had caused the refugee crisis to begin with. To top it off, the head of Fatah Global was photographed with the jihadists of the Caliphate, the same jihadist group that beheaded British volunteer Alan Henning, who had come to Syria on behalf of subsidiaries of Fatah. This report, the sources for this report are the usual suspects: the BBC, Quilliam, David Miliband's International Rescue NGO, a UN report, The Spectator, this type of thing. And it references this second report here from, which is called A Hornet's Nest, a review of charitable spending by UK charities. And I just wanted to run through a couple of the statistics that are quoted in the first report that come from this one. They say more than 195,289 registered charities in the UK, that they collect and spend almost £80 billion a year. They employ 1 million employees and spend, and they make the point that they employ 1 million employees, and that is more than the automobile, aerospace, and chemical sectors in the UK. They spend less than half of their income each year on charitable works. So there's a number of issues here, Brian. The first is it's good to see that somebody has noticed some of the same statistics that we have noticed over the years and are asking the same kinds of questions. But I do question the timing of this once again, bearing in mind that we've got this continuing pressure on the international aid NGOs in particular from the Department for International Development following the Oxfam scandal. And so this seems to me to be, again, just attempting to put further pressure on these NGOs. And I come back to this question of why and why now?
Yes, it's an interesting thing, Mike, isn't it? Actually, I was fascinated by those figures, which I haven't seen before, because the last time I was looking at the value of the charity industry, the total was 44 billion, and you're quoting 80 billion there. So a massive expansion in the charitable industry. And as that report is saying, only a relatively small proportion of that money goes back into proper charitable works. So we could ask how these things have been created. Is it just a gravy train that started out of the fact that if you were a charity, it was fairly easy to get going, get people to put money in, and the things ballooned? Or is something deeper going on? I think something deeper has been going on. I think a lot of these charities have been deliberately cultivated by the government in order to get government policy through. Who comes to my mind? Well, let's take children, for example. The moment the government is talking about anything to do with safeguarding of children, NSPCC or Barnardo's pop their heads up. So the government has been using these organisations to instill its policy on the ground. Why do I think that this is now all of this stuff about funding and the sexual allegations are coming to the surface? I think it's because the government knows that its policies are being exposed to the wider public. People are beginning to see through what the government is really doing. And the government needs to know that its charities will do as they're told. And I think this is a warning going out that if any of these charities dare to step out of line, then they're going to be fully collapsed or the money's going to be pulled. I think this is a threat exercise because these are not proper charities. They're an arm of the government's political agenda.
Yes, okay. Well, let's move on to Bristol Airport then, Brian, and this is what you saw yesterday.
Well, yes, I was going through Bristol Airport. It's on my way to the gate to get the flight up here, up to Glasgow. And I came across this notice. I watched people, of course, 99.9% of people just walked past. I decided to have a look at it. So it's counter-terrorism policing. I'll show in the next slide a bit more detail. But I looked at this thing and I thought, well, what is it here for? What's the purpose of it? On one hand, it's certainly making the public fearful of terrorism by being there and talking about terrorism. But who is it talking to? Because if you're a terrorist, I don't think you're going to take much notice of the fact that there's a sign saying you mustn't be a terrorist. So therefore, it comes down to it's talking to the public. But if you analyse, and if we can pop on to the next slide on screen, and if you press the magic button, we should be able to expand that. There we go. So if we have a look at this thing, this is telling people that the police have got all these powers to stop and question and search. And so as I read through the text, this is a threat to the public. This is saying what the police can do. And if you just scroll down a bit there, you'll see it's talking detention. And then we're going on to stopping a personal vehicle, detaining a person, and it says how long you can be detained for, 6 hours. So the whole bulk of this notice, in my opinion, was to instill fear in the public. It was nothing to do with saying there is a terrorist risk at the moment, but we can reassure you that the police are monitoring this and may carry out checks on individuals. That would be a nice reassuring message. This was a rather threatening tone, and I think there's a little label I'm going to put across this if you press again. What about the run, hide, tell policy? So on one hand, we're supposed to run away from anything to do with terrorism and hide and tell, and then here was a police document. So I just brought it out as something of interest, but you're making an internal flight in UK, and you've got to be worried about terrorism. And if people want to see what this 2000 Terrorism Act is about, here's a snapshot of the opening part of it. And of course, they're saying that anybody that's going to use violence to challenge government policy comes under this Terrorist Act. But it also says anybody that interferes with electronic communications. I found that very interesting, that they specifically protect electronic communications, but those communications are unspecified. Yeah. So a point of interest, really. I didn't fully understand it. Maybe other viewers can understand it better than me.
I wonder, Brian, why they felt the need to notify the public. Is this creating movement? Is this creating consent? Well, we notified you and no one objected.
Yeah, well, it could well be. I could just remind people that in fact nobody has an obligation to help the police. The test case for that is Rice versus Connolly. I can't remember the exact date. I think it might be 1966. But policing is by consent, and it's up to you whether you wish to help the police or not.
Okay, let's move on to the email that you sent to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Dear Mr. Carroll, you're fully aware that my email was directed for the attention of Michael Lockwood, Director General. So this follows on from the conversation that you were having with him a couple of days ago. Please ensure that it is passed on to him to read in person. Was it?
Well, it appears not, Mike. This is all to do with the John Wedger file that former Policing Minister Mike Penning said he handed to the Home Office and then disappeared. And as I've tried to talk to these authorities, IOPC, formerly IPCC, they seem to be very evasive in their answers. And the most important thing for me is I was asking questions of the people running the organisation. I was not asking questions of the media team. I was simply contacting the media team in order to get a response from the organisation. But having said I want a response from the man in charge. I then got this next reply. So now we can see that I've been passed across to the, what do they call it? The customer
contact advisor. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says, thank you for contacting the Independent Office for Police Conduct. We acknowledge receipt of your email sent the 1st of March, which has been filed. Whilst I note that your email is for the attention of Michael Lockwood, he has not had any involvement in this investigation, so it would not be appropriate for him to respond directly. Well, that's very nice, but I sent a question to Mr. Lockwood. He's now in charge of the organisation. So if there were problems in the past and he is now the boss, those problems sit on his desk. But what I find is I've now got a customer services manager blocking my way, and I take exception to that. But I also note that the customer services person is working from a PO box address, and this is something we've flagged up with the Court of Protection. So is this even part of IOPC itself, or are we now dealing with some private organisation? I sent an email back because I wasn't going to give in to that. So this is what I sent back. Whereas it's, dear Mr. Mayargaby, if I pronounce that properly, thank you for your email. I note your second sentence. That was the bit, whilst I note your emails for the attention of Michael Lockwood, he's not had any involvement. And then I asked this gentleman or lady, I'm not sure which it is this your personal opinion? Can you please confirm that Michael Lockwood has personally seen my emails and that the above statement is from him in person? What we've got going on here is media and customer relations teams thinking that they run the organisations themselves. And why do we need to get to grips with this? Because this organisation has been quoting a report which an MP has said has been lost, and they're using that same report to say that there was no evidence to support the testimony of John Wedger, which we've been reporting over the last few days. Yes. So I believe this is very sinister stuff. We've now got government departments which are operating from PO boxes, and when we try and get in contact with those departments, we've got media relations people blocking us.
Okay, let's move back up north of the border, David, and this is from Peter Kirby, a tweet which says, interesting, the UK's Domestic Security and Intelligence Service MI5 are listed in the Training and Coaching Register of Police Scotland. What's going on here?
What indeed? Well, it appears that MI5 are training Police Scotland. Now, the figure here, £5,600, isn't very much, but what we're hearing is there are in fact hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of training expenses, and these are concealed under other items in the general training budget, but the money is going to MI5. MI5 incidentally do have a permanent position or place within a network. The last I heard, they were based at Pitt Street in the main police heads in Pitt Street in Glasgow, and they are operating within Police Scotland, but we hear that the relationship is not very good, because you can imagine who's in charge. It's not Police Scotland.
Yes. Police whistleblowers.
Right, now this is to do with the Emma Caldwell case. Now, the issue with the Emma Caldwell case is that this was a prostitute who was murdered, and there was an investigation by Police Scotland, and no charges were ever brought. There was then a realization that the investigation was flawed, and this is one of the older articles. This dates in 2015, where information was brought forward by whistleblowers to say, in this case, he was asked to lie to the court about what he did and what he saw and who was present, and he was very unhappy about this, and he blew the whistle on it. So there are issues of concern over the investigation of the Emma Caldwell murder. Now, this then was reported robustly in the Scottish press. The response by Police Scotland to this was anger and a determination to find out how the press got hold of the information. And this resulted in Police Scotland spying on members of the press. Now, this next article here from the BBC, this is from November last year. Things had advanced. The police were accused of gross misconduct. They were found to have obtained communications data without judicial permission, and were trying to identify a journalist's sources. And then we come to a Diary of Injustice here. This is a long article, and I encourage people to look this out. It's a long article detailing the evidence given to a Scottish Parliamentary Committee by the Chief Constable of Durham Constabulary, who was brought in to investigate this. I'll just read out one brief part of the exchange. It says, during questions, Mr. Stevenson attempted to make a legal point to Mr. Barton, who's the Chief Constable, stating it would be perfectly legal for Police Scotland to have this intelligence that led to the action. The Chief Constable responded, not if it's wrong. Stuart Stevenson continued, no, I was going to make that point, but having it doesn't make it correct. Police Scotland cannot, the Chief Constable responded, Police Scotland cannot keep something about somebody when it's a lie. And Mr. Stevenson continued, I understand that, but it would be perfectly proper for Police Scotland to have it in the first place before it concluded, as you say, that it was a lie. No, responded the Chief Constable, it was never legitimate for Police Scotland to have this information because they had made it up. So you're seeing here Police Scotland are inventing lies to justify spying on journalists to get at sources who are revealing genuine and accurate failings of Police Scotland to properly investigate a murder. So that's how that particular organisation is currently operating.
Yeah. Okay, we're really running out of time now. You better tell us what's going on tomorrow and why Brian is sitting beside you at the moment.
Well, we brought Brian all the way north because he's speaking at the first roadshow, put back a week because of enormous amounts of snow. The first roadshow for the Fresh Start Foundation, that's a People's Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. That's Edinburgh at the Eric Liddell Centre on Saturday the 10th at 11 o'clock till 3 p.m. And then the following week, we're very pleased to announce that we have John Wedger speaking at the second roadshow, which has been held in Stirling.
Okay, good stuff. And just to end the Scottish section now, just tell us a little bit about this story from the Home Education Forums. This looks like a Facebook page.
Yes, it's from Facebook. This is a young lady called Claire. Now, this lady's came home in the condition you see from school, covered in bruises. The doctor said too many bruises to count. This was due to restraint. This was due to the way she had been essentially assaulted at her school by the school staff in North Lanarkshire Council. A couple of very interesting things about this. Firstly, there's not been any real justice. There is no move by the Procurator Fiscal to make anyone actually stand accountable for it. Secondly, this information was brought to the mainstream press, who have sat on the story, and it's published on this Facebook page because the press did not move. And thirdly, had these bruises been inflicted by a parent, that child would have been immediately seized by the state. Here, these bruises are inflicted by members of staff at North Lanarkshire Council. Nothing really happened.
Okay, well, Brian, any thoughts?
Well, it's unfortunately what we are seeing. I'm going to say straight away, we know there are a great many good people working within children's services trying to do a good job, but we also know there's some extremely bad people. There's no question of this. But when parents or other guardians of children attempt to expose these people and their deeds, then all of a sudden the state comes in to protect the abusers. And of course, this tells us that there is something very wrong at the highest positions of power in both Scotland and the UK. What's good about the conference tomorrow is this is people now starting to say, well, if the government is going to do it, we are going to run the inquiry we are going to do the investigation. And this is very, very powerful. So I think, David, you've been instrumental with others here north of the border, but in creating this event, and the fact that people are in a professional, quiet, reasonable, measured way, they are going to do the investigating to see why events like the terrible beating of that young lady, how that can take place, and the state defends those responsible.
It's people standing up on the common law, standing up for justice and coming together to seek that justice, because our government has failed us.
Yep. Okay, David, Brian, thank you very much for joining me today. That's all we've got time for now. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time, 1 p.m. on Monday. And have a good weekend in the meantime. Bye-bye.